I'm always a little leery when Paul Osteen introduces me, because I know he tells the truth all the time, but he doesn't always tell the strict truth when he's talking about me. But anyway, I'm going to share a little time with you about the start of Samaritan's Purse, the start of World Medical Mission, how we got involved, and even though it's going to be about the past, my prayer is that it will be some kind of direction to you for your future. And it started, Franklin Graham was a senior at Appalachian State University there in Boone, North Carolina, and my brother Lowell and I were surgeons there at the same time. And we were invited, Lowell and I were invited to the Billy Graham Crusade in Asheville. And when they found we were surgeons, there were mission hospitals in India that they said needed some help. So they asked if we would go for a month each. And so we did, and that month changed our lives, because we came back and we started telling Franklin about such a need over there greater than was back home. And Franklin argued that, no, there's not that kind of need for short-term doctors. I know you had a good trip and all of that, but really not a need, or that someone would be doing it. So he said he would, before even thinking about starting an organization, that he would write 30 mission hospitals, which he did. And he got a response back from 28 of them, and 18 of them thought he had already started the organization and said, "Send doctors now." So I don't keep close record of all the arguments that Franklin and I get into, but I know that was the first one, and I know that I knew there was a need, and I reminded him that I won that argument. But it wasn't too much later that we began to realize that there was still the need to get the doctors. When Franklin committed to that, Lowell and I wrote 17 surgeons that we knew, told them about World Medical Mission, that we were starting the program, and would they be willing to go for a month. 15 of the 17 said that they would go. I'm going to give you a verse to let you realize where we were at that time. And it says, "In his heart a man makes his plans, but the Lord directs his steps." That's in Proverbs 16:9. And we started. So I'm encouraging the ones of you here, especially the younger ones, the nurses, the doctors, med students, whatever, that if you feel the Lord calling you to do something, to start your plans. He will direct your steps. Sometimes where you end up is a lot different than where you go, where you're planning to go. But it's always good to look back and see the Lord's hand in what you've done and what you're doing. And I hate to say it took 2 years before we actually saw that happening with us. And I'm going to give you a passage in Ezekiel 37. You remember the story about the dry bones. It says, "This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will attach tendons to you and make flesh come upon you and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord." I want to give you tell you about the time when the Lord put breath into World Medical Mission. This was the third year, beginning of the third year. I had my family in Kajabi in Kenya, and Franklin came over and said, "Let's go up to a hospital named Tenwick." I think it's about a 40-bed hospital at the time. We went up there. Ernie Story was the surgeon there, and he looked like he didn't have much life in him. Things weren't going right. He had 3 in a bed. He wanted to expand the hospital. He asked Franklin if Samaritan's Purse could help him raise money to expand the hospital. But what was really getting him is that he was the only working doctor there. There was one other doctor who had hepatitis in bed. So Ernie was planning to take, in 1 month, take a year furlough, a much needed furlough. And he showed us the letter. We were out on the lawn of the hospital. He showed us the letter, and it was from the doctor that was going to replace him, who just let him know that he couldn't come. So Ernie, he looked like a little whipped puppy or something. He just looked terrible. And he asked Franklin if World Medical Mission could send a doctor a month to replace him for that year, beginning a month from then. So Franklin gathered us, the three of us stood around, and we had, Franklin led us in prayer, and he said, Lord, you know the situation, we need doctors to go, and we're going to depend on you to get those doctors. And when he finished the prayer, of course, Ernie, he was smiling. He looked completely relieved, like, okay, he could go ahead and continue packing. Well, flying back to Nairobi that afternoon, I really scolded Franklin. I said, Franklin, you have no idea what it takes to get a doctor. I said, last year we sent 7 doctors to the field. Now you're saying I'm going to get 12 and starting in a month, and it takes several months to even get one ready to go. So I explained to him that he gave Ernie a false sense of hope. So when we got back to the hotel, and Becky Williams, who's here today, who's been with us forever, we had a note to call her. So we called her, and she said, this afternoon there was a doctor from Pennsylvania who was going to take his family on a vacation next month, beginning in about 3 weeks. Said he was just wondering if there's a place that he should take them on the mission field rather than where he had planned. So we saw, that was the time that I saw that the Lord breathed into World Medical Mission. And of course, Franklin had to point out that he was right and I was wrong. And I had to admit, yeah, you're right, Franklin. I said, now the score is 42-3. So anyway, but that changed our outlook. It changed our plans. We knew he was directing our steps. And we knew that we had a calling that God was going to lead us on. And went over back to Kajabi and realized something that we tell our post-residents today, that the physical health of a patient is important, but more important is the spiritual health. And what we started doing and realizing, we needed to know the patient's spiritual history as well as their physical history. So the charts at Kajabi were hanging on the end of the bed. So there was a medical student rotating with me. He was there for the same month. And we started going, we called them after supper rounds. We'd go around after we ate that evening and make rounds, and we'd take the chart and we'd ask the patient if they were Christian or not. If they were, we'd put a little plus up in the right-hand corner. If they weren't, we'd put a little minus. And those were the patients, the ones with the minuses were the ones we would go back and talk to about the Lord. Those are the ones we told the chaplains to go see the next day. And this went on, and it was really nice to come make rounds the next day and see that minus change into a plus, knowing that patient had accepted Christ. So that was a time when we realized that their spiritual health was more important than their physical health. And then we started seeing, as World Medical Mission Samaritan's Purse grew, we started seeing that there were hardships. There were equipment. There were times that I remember being in Nepal, doing a tracheoesophageal fistula closure on a little baby. And as we're getting almost through, I had the fistula closed, and noticed the heart was beating slower and slower. And I looked over the ether screen, and the nurse anesthetist looked up. He was breathing, taking a breath, and then breathing into the little endotracheal tube. I said, what's going on? He said, we're out of oxygen. I said, well, get some more. And he said, there's no more in the hospital, and there's no more in Kathmandu. We started seeing, go to a hospital, broken arm, no x-ray. So talking to Franklin, we need to start getting equipment to these hospitals. So we started working on that. Then we saw hospitals that needed new operating rooms. We saw hospitals that needed completely rebuilt. And this is what Samaritan's Purse has done. Right now we've just built duplex housing for post-residents. Right now we have 5 hospitals, mission hospitals, that Samaritan's Purse is helping to build. And so you could see the Lord using us in responding to the need. But there was one thing that as time went on, as the years went on, one thing that we noticed, that there were fewer and fewer full-time physicians. And same way with nursing, fewer and fewer full-time nurses on the field. So what could be done? We thought we were doing everything possible, but it just wasn't working out. And we realized there's an organization called MedSyn that's here this weekend. We realized what was happening was the residents were getting through their training and they had a huge debt. MedSyn started answering that by saying, okay, if you're on the field, I don't know what it is, 10 years or whatever, they'll help pay that debt off. But we realized that these doctors were getting out of the residency and starting it, they'd buy a house, they'd think, well, they can pay the debt off in 2 years, 3 years, but they never got on the field. And Ken Isaacs, who's now has our mobile hospital up and running, he's here today. He said, one day, he said, what about getting the young doctors, when they finish, as soon as they finish their residency, what about getting them to go for 2 years just as a trial? Because Samaritan's Purse had that plan already set up where you could go for a 2-year trial for Samaritan's Purse. I thought that sounded great. The problem, after a few years, we realized only about 20% were staying full-time. So we were not answering that call that we thought we were called to get full-time doctors. So we decided to change, and again, this is like God breathing into the organization again. We decided to start zeroing in on, are you called for full-time mission? Aileen Coleman, who you heard last night speak, she gave us something to put on the applications. It says, we are looking for missionaries who happen to be doctors. So now the post-residency program, that's what we have now, is to look for missionaries who happen to be doctors. When we did those two things, the 20% changed to 75 to 80%. And we just feel like and that's why I encourage you, make your plans and get started and then watch the Lord, see what He does to it. But we feel like that Samaritan's Purse and World Medical Mission, that God's going to use us for the next 10 years. I think the majority of the hospitals will be rebuilt. The majority of the doctors that are there will be through the post-residency program. I think the Lord's using us for that. So hopefully today is one of those times you'll have a moment where you will follow the Lord's calling on that. But I want to ask you the first question. I want to ask you another question. Are you fully committed? Are you wholeheartedly committed to what the Lord wants to do in your life? You remember those 15 surgeons that wrote back and said they would go? None of them went. None of them ended up going even for a month on the mission field. They had the desire to go, and that was great. There's a lot of people that have the desire to do the Lord's work, but the question is, are you fully committed? And there's a difference in desire and being committed. Desire is of the mind. It doesn't require any action. But being fully committed, being wholly committed, is of the heart. And that does require action. Aileen Coleman mentioned Caleb last night. And I remind you what made Caleb like a full-time missionary. And I'll read what it says in Numbers 14. It says, "But because my servant Caleb has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly," this is God speaking, it says, "I will bring him into the land he went to, and his descendants will inherit it." Well, you fast forward that 40 years, and you read they've already gone in now, and Caleb initially went up to Hebron. That's where the spies went into, and this is what's said about Caleb 40 years later. "So Hebron has belonged to Caleb ever since, because he followed the Lord, the God of Israel, wholeheartedly." So what I'm saying is that unless you do commit wholeheartedly, like Caleb, the odds of you staying on the field, the odds of you being a missionary nurse, a missionary doctor, whatever, the ones even that stay here at home, unless you're wholeheartedly committed to the Lord, it's not going to work. Things are going to come up that will keep you from doing what the Lord has called you to do. And we just look, especially with the post-residents, we have one post-resident lost a child. We know Sarah Lance, who was a post-resident, recently passed away from cancer. Kent and Amber Brantley had the Ebola. There are things that will come up that will keep you from doing what the Lord wants to see done in you. And I just encourage you, go ahead and start making your plans, get started, and then you can look back and see where the Lord has breathed life into what you're doing. And it'd be no greater joy to me than to someday be visiting a mission hospital and see you there. Thank you.